Narcissists in Literature. Heathcliff. Hello, I'm H.G. Tudor, continuing the series of examining narcissists in literature. 2 points before I commence. First, always keep in mind that narcissists in literature are fictional, and therefore there may be aspects of the personality as described that don't completely fit with that of narcissistic personality disorder because of the requirements of plot development, character arc, character development, and so forth. Therefore, there may be aspects which don't quite fit with someone who would be a narcissist. Often this relates to the individual suddenly finding redemption or changing, which, as you know, a narcissist cannot do with any permanence. It's important to keep those points in mind, as you may find aspects which you would think, I don't think that really sits with narcissism. And you'd be right, but it's more a literary device. The second point is that with many of these characters, one could write entire theses about them. There's a lot of material, and I'm not going to advance every single point that may be demonstrative of the existence of narcissism. And therefore, if something has been missed out that you thought ought to be included, it's not because I've overlooked it, but simply I can't include everything, and furthermore, certain aspects just repeat and emphasize existing points. For instance, you'll find lots of instances demonstrating a sense of entitlement, so one doesn't have to list them all. With that stated, let's consider Heathcliff. Heathcliff is a fictional character in Emily Bronte's 1847 novel, Withering Heights. Owing to the novel's enduring fame and popularity, he's often regarded as an archetype of the tortured anti-hero whose all-consuming rage, jealousy, and anger destroy both him and those around him. In short, the Byronic hero. I'm going to consider whether he isn't that, and in actual fact what you're witnessing is a narcissist. He's better known for being a romantic hero due to his youthful love for Catherine Earnshaw than for his final years of vengeance in the second half of the novel, during which he grows into a bitter, haunted man, and for a number of incidents in his early life that suggest that he was an upset and sometimes malicious individual from the very beginning. His complicated, mesmerizing, absorbing, and altogether bizarre nature makes him a rare character, incorporating elements of both the hero and villain, which also demonstrates the complexity of certain narcissists, and remember that certain aspects that are included wouldn't be true to the narcissist but have been included because, at the end of the day, it's there to entertain and it's a work of fiction. A foundling, discovered on the streets of Liverpool and raised by the Earnshaw family of Withering Heights in Yorkshire, Heathcliff's past and early childhood before his mysterious adoption are only hinted at. In keeping with the supernatural themes present in the novel, it is speculated that Heathcliff might be a demon or a hellish soul. You'll be familiar with those that believe that narcissists are demons. His appearance would be faithfully interpreted as resembling a Roma or gypsy, as he is described with dark hair, dark eyes, and dark skin. Later in life, he becomes a gentleman in dress and aspect. Nellie Dean states that he could be an American castaway. Heathcliff may have been of mixed race because he's described in the original book as a dark-skinned gypsy, a little lascar, a 19th century term for Indian sailors. In Chapter 4, Heathcliff is described by Mr. Earnshaw to be as dark, almost as if he came from the devil. In Chapter 7, Nellie Dean asks of him, "Who knows but your father was Emperor of China, and your mother an Indian queen?" A silent and at first solitary child, Heathcliff is initially resented by both Catherine Earnshaw and her elder brother. Thus, we have an individual who has been abandoned by his mother, which would suggest a lack of control environment. And he finds himself in those formative years in an environment where he's resented by his new siblings. While Catherine later befriends Heathcliff, Hindley continues to resent him, seeing him as an interloper who has stolen his father's affection. Upon Mr. Earnshaw's death and his inheritance of the estate, the spiteful Hindley proceeds to treat Heathcliff as little more than a servant boy, and makes him work the fields, which compounds the threat of loss of control to Heathcliff and also cements his rage and resentment. As Catherine matures into her young teens, she grows close to Edgar Linton, a timid and well-bred young man from the neighbouring estate, Thrushcross Grange, and accepts his proposal of marriage, but she insists that her true and only love is Heathcliff. She claims that she cannot marry him because it would degrade her, humiliation, threat to control, and the two would be beggars were such a union to take place. Nevertheless, she also declares her passion for him in such ways as, "Whatever our souls are made of, his and mine are the same," and the famous quote, "I am Heathcliff." Catherine, of course, would bear separate analysis. Aware only of Catherine's decision to marry Edgar, rather than her proclamation of true love for him, a bitter Heathcliff leaves Withering Heights upon overhearing her saying that it would degrade her and while away, by means unknown, makes his fortune. Nellie Dean describes him as lazy when he returns, and that his upright carriage suggests him being in the army. No other hints are given about where Heathcliff was and how he made his fortune over the course of his 3-year absence. On returning, he is ruthlessly determined to destroy those who degraded him and prevented him from being with Catherine, cementing his status as an anti-hero, rather than a romantic hero. Not only does he swindle Hindley, who has fallen into alcoholism and gambling after the death of his wife, lack of emotional empathy, manipulation, out of his ownership of Wuthering Heights and Hindley's son's inheritance, he heartlessly takes advantage of Edgar Linton's sister Isabella and marries her, before treating her in a cruel and contemptuous fashion, lack of emotional empathy, devaluing behaviours. Although he tells Catherine that he despises Isabella and would cut his own throat if he imagined Catherine wanted him to marry Edgar's younger sister, his and Isabella's marriage promises to result in his inheriting Thrushcross Grange on Linton's death. This can only be achieved, however, by Heathcliff forcing his and Isabella's son Linton into marriage with Catherine's daughter, who is called Cathy. After Catherine Earnshaw's death, Heathcliff's vindictive cruelty intensifies, aimed at destroying not only his enemies but also their heirs. Hareton, son of Hindley and Frances Earnshaw, and Catherine, daughter of Edgar Linton and Catherine the Elder, Heathcliff forces his sickly son Linton, who entirely resembles his mother Isabella, into marriage with Catherine Linton, lack of emotional empathy, sense of entitlement ordering about. Shortly after the two are married in their nearly loveless match, the insipid Linton dies, hardly a surprise to either his father or his widow. Heathcliff treats Catherine with relative mercy, turning her into a cold, distant creature, far removed from the bright, lively girl she used to be. Hareton and Catherine eventually fall in love, however, and their relationship in some way mirrors and in other ways opposes that between Heathcliff and the elder Catherine. Their union breaks the cycle of hatred at Wuthering Heights, and Heathcliff no longer cares to continue his vendetta. Wuthering Heights is the story of extremely neglected children who neither have a mother nor a sufficient surrogate. All the mothers die prematurely, leaving their children into the hands of insufficient caretakers. Wuthering Heights portrays a world of sadism, violence and wanton cruelty, wherein the children, without the protection of their mothers, have to fight for very life against adults who show almost no tenderness, love or mercy. Very much a crucible of a lack of control environment. For Heathcliff, with an abandoned mother and no father, of parentage unknown, he finds himself then thrust into this crucible, facing repeated threats to his control. Some of the symptoms of narcissistic personality disorder, such as striving for power, the need for control, projection, the necessity of revenge and self-destruction, are seen all through the novel, and especially with Heathcliff. He ruins his life and others, and, like other characters, destroys peace and unity, yet, throughout, he has that feeling of emptiness. Heathcliff's desire to gain power to take his revenge on his former tormentors, namely Hindley and Edgar, is as a consequence of his narcissism. His former tormentors threatened his control, they're painted black, and his narcissism leads him to want to take that revenge thereafter. Heathcliff, in some ways, resembles other victimized children, for example Pip in Great Expectations, or the monster in Frankenstein, who are abandoned and have been subject to constant humiliation, physical and psychological abuse. At the very beginning, when Mr. Earnshaw brings Heathcliff home, Catherine grins and spits at him, and Hindley instantly hates him. Heathcliff does not have any information about his biological mother and father. The first mother figure, Mrs. Earnshaw, rejects him, threat to control, and his situation worsens after Hindley takes over patriarchy soon after Mr. Earnshaw's death. Catherine writes, "Poor Heathcliff. Hindley calls him vagabond and won't let him sit with us, nor eat with us any more. Exclusion, threat to control. And he says he and I must not play together, and threatens to turn him out of the house if we break his orders, and swears he will reduce him to his right place." Repeatedly humiliated, threatened, subjected to these repeated threats to control. Hindley starts with preventing his education and goes on reducing him to the status of a servant. Catherine and Heathcliff go to Thrushcross Grange secretly and watch the Lynchon children. However, Catherine falls down and gets caught by a dog before they're able to run away. Her ankle is hurt, so she has to stay at Thrushcross Grange for a while. When she returns back to Withering Heights from Thrushcross Grange after the accident, Hindley says, "You may come and wish Miss Catherine welcome, like the other servants." Humiliation comes both physically and psychologically for Heathcliff. Parents of this nature frequently criticise their children in a way that makes them worthless, rejected and inferior. Abused in this manner, someone like Heathcliff learns to see power as a way to protect himself. He starts to use a means of power to beat the sensation of inferiority and worthlessness, and thus his narcissism comes into being. Living under and being controlled by another individual's power gives a repeated sensation to Heathcliff in those formative years of humiliation, and thus the only way for him to cope with that, the only way for him to overcome this threat to control, is to reverse the situation by gaining power over the person who inflicted the threat. This is the primary applier of the threat, but as I've explained elsewhere, that when anybody ever threatens the control of the narcissist, that initial primary threat giver is sublimated into the role of subsequent threats, and thus each time, for instance, if it was a mother, which was the initial primary provider of threat to that child, thereafter, any threat to control that might come from spouse, from friend, from sibling, it's as if the mother has stepped into that role once again. And thus, that is why the narcissist must respond against you or the spouse or the brother or the friend to nullify the threat to control as if they are nullifying the threat to control posed by that initial primary threat. Heathcliff wants revenge. His desire in that regard is quite clear. "I'd not exchange," he states, "for 1,000 lives my condition here for Edgar Linton's at Thrushcross Grange, not if I might have the privilege of flinging Joseph off the highest gable and painting the house front with Hindley's blood." When Heathcliff is locked up by Hindley, he says, "I'm trying to settle how I shall pay Hindley back. I don't care how long I wait, if I can only do it at last. I hope I will not die before I do." When Ellen Dean warns him to leave punishment to God, he says, "No, God won't have the satisfaction that I shall. I only wish I knew the best way. Let me alone and I'll plan it out. While I'm thinking of that, I don't feel pain." This exhibits grandiosity, as likening the way that he would be even superior to God with regard to feeling satisfaction of punishment, that he rejects the intervention of the Almighty, and instead that he gains a form of comfort by thinking on how he shall mete out his revenge. In Withering Heights, however, Heathcliff fails in working through his losses. His mourning, in effect, becomes pathological, as his reaction reveals itself in rage, in self-destruction. The reason for this can be explained through Heathcliff's exposure to a lack of control environment, principally the loss of a stable maternal influence. According to theorists, the first 3 years of a child's life is very important, as the formation of the self occurs in infancy through his or her relationships with the primary caretaker, who's usually the mother. During the early months of life, an infant is learning to discriminate a particular figure, usually his mother, and is developing a strong liking to be in her company. Throughout the latter half of the first year and during the whole of his second and third year, he's closely attached to his mother figure, which means that he is content in her company and distressed in her absence, which is, of course, a lack of control environment. Heathcliff was abandoned by his mother, and no mother replacement was made available to him. This naturally threatened his inherent need for control and created a form of pathological mourning in an inability to express overtly these urges to recover and attack the lost person, with all the yearning for and rage with that deserter that it entails. Thus, he's denied the capacity to mete it out as against the person that let him down. Thus, he sees everybody as letting him down, and thus revenge must be meted out against them. Although maternal loss is a central concern in the novel, and with regard to Heathcliff, none of the children mourn for their lost mothers. In addition to this, no one actually talks about their deaths. For example, Mrs. Earnshaw dies 2 years after Heathcliff's arrival, but there's no sign of mourning for her in the novel. Similarly, Cathy Linton never questions her mother's death, shows no curiosity about her life. This evidences one of the major problems between these characters, including Heathcliff, because none of them are able to build healthy object relations in later years. Mr. Earnshaw, however, does try to play mother by bringing Heathcliff to his home, and he might be seen as an intervener that could perhaps have arrested the lack of control environment that Heathcliff was subjected to. But Mrs. Earnshaw never approves of the boy. Mr. Earnshaw sees him as his favourite, and he gives him the name of his dead child, Heathcliff. This might be an attempt, albeit futile, of Mr. Earnshaw to reunite with a lost love object. He does this, but puts Heathcliff in an even worse position because he puts him above everything and neglects his own children, which only heightens the hate in the household and the lack of control environment towards Heathcliff. In a way, Mr. Earnshaw kills Heathcliff, metaphorically at least, by naming him with the name of the deceased boy. Ellen Dean says, "Still, I couldn't dote on Heathcliff, and I wondered often what my master saw to admire so much in the sullen boy, who never to my recollection repaid his indulgence by any sign of gratitude. He was not insolent to his benefactor, he was simply insensible." Thus, despite the fact that Mr. Earnshaw had shown kindness of a sort to Heathcliff, by then it was too late, that the nature of his personality was such that he would not respond with gratitude. In the course of time, Mr. Earnshaw began to fail. He had been active and healthy, yet his strength left him suddenly, and when he was confined to the chimney corner, he grew grievously irritable. And nothing vexed him, and suspected slights of his authority nearly threw him into fits. This was especially to be remarked if anyone attempted to impose upon or domineer over his favourite. He was painfully jealous lest a word should be spoken amiss to him, seeming to have got into his head the notion that, because he liked Heathcliff, all hated and longed to do him an ill turn. It was a disadvantage to the lad, for the kinder among us did not wish to fret the master, so we humoured his partiality, and that humouring was rich nourishment to the child's pride and black tempers. So Heathcliff finds himself subjected to a lack of control environment by the loss of his biological mother, that he finds himself thrust into an environment where most people actually hate him, including Catherine and Hindley. But then, in order to compensate for that, and to seek favour from Mr. Earnshaw, that they start to dote upon him, and they humour his partiality, But the problem there is that simply creates an alternative lack of control environment, because it means that Heathcliff is being given reactions which he's not actually earned. Mr. Earnshaw is jealous of the love between Catherine and Heathcliff. He doesn't like to see that Catherine is more influential on Heathcliff than he does, what her father hated most, showing how her pretended insolence, which he thought real, had more power over Heathcliff than his kindness, how the boy would do her bidding in anything, and his only when it suited his own inclination. After Catherine's death, Heathcliff's attacks on his former tormentors become more brutal and intense. The desire is to take revenge, and that's displaced from Catherine and directed to others. Thus, he seeks to preserve her as a love object and destroy all others. Heathcliff has suffered a threat to control through maternal loss all through his life. He's no idea of his biological mother. The mother surrogate, Mrs. Earnshaw, rejected him immediately, and the only figure that he might have attached to, Catherine, abandons him. In other words, he loses the mother figure when the mother and the infant are still a unit, and that means that Heathcliff suffers a massive threat to control and loses part of himself with the formation of his narcissism. Heathcliff has no ability to create attachments with other people. He can't love anyone. He proves this by rejecting his own son Linton. Linton loses his mother, Isabella, before his 12th birthday. Heathcliff starts to hate his son, lack of emotional empathy, abrogation of parental responsibilities and duties, even before he actually sees him. When Ellen Dean says that his name is Linton, Heathcliff asks, "They wish me hate it too, do they?" When Ellen Dean brings Linton to Withering Heights, he says, "Oh, damn my soul, but that's worse than I expected, and the devil knows I was not sanguine." He calls Linton a pitiful, shuffling, worthless thing. Devaluation, humiliation. In fact, his mother does not draw a positive portrait of him. She describes Linton as an ailing, peevish creature. Ellen Dean really dislikes him and says, "Like him," I explained, "the worst-tempered bit of a sickly slip that ever struggled into his teens. Happily, as Mr. Heathcliff conjectured, he'll not win 20. I doubt whether he'll see spring indeed, and small loss to his family whenever he drops off. And lucky it is for us." There is a chain of poor parenting that exists throughout the novel. Hindley was not loved and accepted by his father, so he was cruel towards Heathcliff, and neglects his own son. Heathcliff had threats to control in his childhood, as mentioned, so he becomes a bad father to the next generation, Hareton, Linton, and Cathy. What prevents Heathcliff from despising Hareton entirely is his striking resemblance to his Aunt Catherine. Heathcliff says, "He moves me differently, and yet if I could do it without seeming insane, I'd never see him again. You'll perhaps think me rather inclined to become so if I try to describe the 1,000 forms of past associations and ideas he wakens or embodies. 5 minutes ago, Hareton seemed a personification of my youth, not a human being. Notice the extension of self. I felt to him in such a variety of ways that it would have been impossible to have accosted him rationally. In the first place, his startling likeness to Catherine connected him fearfully with her objectification, while Hareton's aspect was the ghost of my immortal love, of my wild endeavours to hold my right, my degradation, my pride, my happiness, and my anguish. Revenge is a clear motive through Withering Heights. Heathcliff actually exhibits similarities with Hamlet, another individual focused upon revenge. Although they are wildly different, the set of events are similar. Both men have caused deaths, both have thrown themselves into the graves of their lovers, and in the end both died. Heathcliff, in his novel, is seeking revenge solely for himself. He feels as if he's been wronged, saying, "I want you to be aware that I know you have treated me infernally, victim mentality. And if you think I can be consoled by sweet words, you are an idiot, contempt. And if you fancy I'll suffer unrevenged, I'll convince you of the contrary in a very little while." Revenge for oneself is naturally a narcissistic trait. Both the narcissist's inflated social confidence and the narcissist's sense of entitlement produces a desire to retaliate against wrongdoers, and reduces any constraints that might exist on acting on this desire. This quote nearly directly parallels what Heathcliff is saying to Catherine. Heathcliff can be clearly seen as a narcissist. He kidnaps his niece, beats his wife and son, and emotionally manipulates Nellie on many occasions. Naturally, this is indicative of the narcissist's abuse, both mental and physical. The fact that Heathcliff seeks revenge and does so entirely for himself is linked to his narcissism. Heathcliff was governed by his narcissism and enacted his revenge only for himself. Thus, he became the villain in his respective story. Heathcliff's actions throughout the novel serve as clear indicators of his narcissism. From his relentless pursuit of revenge against those who've wronged him to his unyielding desire for power and control, Heathcliff's behaviours are motivated by a deep-seated need for validation, fuel, and dominance, control. For instance, his treatment of others, particularly his mistreatment of those he perceives as inferior, showcases his complete lack of emotional empathy and his disregard for the feelings of those around him. One of the primary ways in which Heathcliff displays his narcissism is through his manipulation of those around him. He consistently uses individuals as pawns in his schemes, manipulating their emotions and exploiting their vulnerabilities to further his own agenda. A notable example of this is his treatment of Isabella Linton, whom he marries solely as a means of gaining control over Thrushcross Grange and exacting revenge on the Linton family. Despite knowing that Isabella is infatuated with him, Heathcliff marries her not out of love or genuine affection, for he has neither, but rather as a means to gain control over the Grange and exact revenge. He manipulates her emotions, leading her to believe in a false sense of love and security, all the while using her for his entirely own selfish purposes. This exploitative dynamic highlights Heathcliff's lack of emotional empathy and his willingness to use others to fulfill his dreams without concern for their well-being. Heathcliff's need for admiration and validation is apparent in his relationships with Catherine Earnshaw and later with her daughter Catherine Linton. His obsession with Catherine borders on a form of narcissistic fixation, as he is unable, like any narcissist, to accept her rejection and seeks to possess her through ownership at all costs, thus controlling her, even if it means destroying those around him in the process. Throughout the novel, he employs numerous strategies to control those around him, distorting the truth and manipulating emotions to suit his own agenda. His treatment of Catherine Earnshaw is a clear example of this behaviour, as he seeks to mould her emotions and loyalties to align with his own desires. In essence, he wants to subsume her within him. He distorts her perceptions of reality. He asserts control over her and reinforces his own power of influence, showcasing his manipulative nature. His inability to form genuine connections with others and his lack of emotional intimacy further demonstrates his narcissism. With regards to Catherine Earnshaw, his relationship with her is fraught with possessiveness and jealousy. He fixates on possessing her as a means of validating his own self-worth, and it prevents him from forming a healthy relationship with anybody. His inability to connect with others on a deep emotional level underscores his narcissism and his profound self-absorption. He repeatedly prioritizes his own needs and desires above the emotional well-being of those around him. He not only wanted, but needed to be with Catherine. He didn't even recognize her marriage to Edgar Linton as reality, delusion. He turned his whole life around in order to achieve this relationship with Catherine. He needed to have confirmation of their undying love for each other, which of course he actually doesn't experience love, and this is a form of control and delusion. In order to achieve this relationship with Catherine, he thought that he needed to gain both Withering Heights and Thrushcross Grange, which he did. Although this was for someone else, he changed what he was. He created a false persona in order to have this unrealistic relationship with Catherine, demonstrating the way that the construct shifts and alters. He idealized Cathy. He was obsessed with her from the start, building a very close relationship with her to the point where she considers them the same person, telling Ellen, "I am Heathcliff." In fact, his near idolatry worship of Cathy is the basis of entire need for revenge, and drives his obsession with the younger Cathy and the ownership of Withering Heights. His obsession and need for control over Cathy is demonstrated in this famous exchange. "Yes, she's dead," I answered, checking my sobs and drying my cheeks. "Gone to heaven, I hope, where we may everyone join her, if we take due warning and leave our evil ways to follow good." "Did she take due warning, then?" asked Heathcliff, attempting a sneer. "Did she die like a saint? Come, give me a true history of the event. How did—" He endeavoured to pronounce the name, but could not manage it, and compressing his mouth, he held a silent combat with his inward agony, defying, meanwhile, my sympathy with an unflinching, ferocious stare. "How did she die?" he resumed at last, fain, notwithstanding his hardihood, to have a support behind him, for after the struggle he trembled, in spite of himself, to his very finger ends. "Poor wretch," I thought, "you have a heart and nerves the same as your brother men. Why should you be so anxious to conceal them? Your pride cannot blind God. You tempt him to wring them. He forces a cry of humiliation." "Quietly as a lamb," I answered aloud. She drew a sigh and stretched herself like a child reviving and sinking again to sleep, and 5 minutes after I felt one little pulse at her heart, and nothing more. And did she ever mention me?" he asked, hesitating, as if he dreaded the answer to his question would introduce details that he could not bear to hear. "Her senses never returned. She recognised nobody from the time you left her," I said. "She lies with a sweet smile on her face, and her latest ideas wandered back to pleasant early days. Her life closed in a gentle dream. May she wake as kindly in the other world." "May she wake in torment!" he cried, with frightful vehemence, stamping his foot and groaning in a sudden paroxysm of ungovernable passion. "Why, she's a liar to the end! Where is she? Not there, not in heaven, not perished. Where? Oh, you said you cared nothing for my sufferings, and I pray one prayer. I repeat it till my tongue stiffens, Catherine Earnshaw. May you not rest as long as I am living. You said I killed you. Haunt me then. The murdered do haunt their murderers, I believe. I know that ghosts have wandered on earth. Be with me always. Take any form. Drive me mad. Only do not leave me in this abyss where I cannot find you. Oh God, it is unutterable. I cannot live without my life. I cannot live without my soul." He dashed his head against the knotted trunk, and lifting up his eyes, howled, not like a man, but like a savage beast getting goaded to death with knives and spears. I observed several splashes of blood about the bark of the tree, and his hand and forehead were both stained. Probably the scene I witnessed was a repetition of others acted during the night. It hardly moved my compassion, it appalled me. Still, I felt reluctant to quit him so. But the moment he recollected himself enough to notice me watching, he thundered a command for me to go, and I obeyed. He was beyond my skill to quiet or console. There we witness the ignited fury of Heathcliff as he experiences the threat to control caused by the death, and thereafter he utters those words as part of the need to nullify the threat to control, crying out to the very person that has deserted him. Once again, in that instant, he's crying out to that first primary issuer of the threat, most likely his mother, who had abandoned him. And in the loss and the repeated threats that he suffers thereafter, each time it's as if his mother is stepping into those shoes. Thus, such is the heat-ignited fury that you witness with those words. A further hallmark trait of narcissism is a sense of entitlement, and Heathcliff exemplifies this trait repeatedly throughout the novel. His actions reflect a belief that the world owes him something, and he's willing to go to great lengths to claim what he believes is rightfully his. His sense of self-importance and grandiosity further illustrates his tendencies of narcissism. He exudes an air of superiority, haughtiness, and an unwavering belief in his own importance and entitlement. Despite his humble origins and social standing, Heathcliff views himself as deserving of wealth, power, and love from others, and he will stop at nothing to claim what he perceives as rightfully his. This inflated sense of self-worth contributes to his manipulative behaviour and his disregard for the feelings and needs of those around him, as he prioritises his own desires above all else. A further example of Heathcliff's sense of entitlement is his treatment of Hindley Earnshaw and his attempts to usurp control of Withering Heights following Mr. Earnshaw's death. Heathcliff's belief that he is entitled to inherit the estate reflects his grandiose sense of self, and his conviction that he deserves power and status despite lacking the social standing traditionally associated with such privileges. Central to the concept of narcissism, as you know, is the absence of emotional empathy, and Heathcliff's character embodies this trait in a variety of different ways. He has no ability to empathise with the suffering of others, and he repeatedly is most willing to inflict pain and hardship on those around him. It highlights his profound emotional detachment and self-centred focus. For instance, he hangs the dogs at one juncture and then boasts about doing so to his wife. A clear lack of emotional empathy. His treatment of Hareton Earnshaw serves as an example of his lack of empathy. Despite being Hareton's guardian, Heathcliff subjects the young man to abuse and neglect, viewing him only as a means to an end rather than as a vulnerable individual in need of care and compassion. This callous disregard for Hareton's well-being underscores Heathcliff's narcissism. His destructive behaviour and impulsivity serve as further evidence of this narcissism. His relentless pursuit of revenge, notably against the Earnshaw and Linton families, demonstrates an inability to regulate his emotions and his willingness to engage in destructive actions to gratify his own desires. This impulsivity, coupled with his lack of emotional empathy for others, leads to a cycle of pain and suffering that permeates the lives of all those connected to him. Heathcliff's disregard for the consequences of his actions and his tendency to act on his impulses without regard for others' well-being underscores his narcissistic tendencies and his profound sense of self-absorption. He shows a need for fuel. For instance, in this quote, he took a seat opposite Catherine, who kept her gaze fixed on him as if she feared he would vanish, were she to remove it. He did not raise his to her often. A quick glance now and then sufficed, but it flashed back each time more confidently, the undisguised delight he drank from hers. An example of where he deals with the threat to control. Based on the quotation below, it proves when Edgar, who manages to punch Heathcliff's face, making Heathcliff feel insulted, he then states, "Do you suppose I'm going with that blow burning in my gullet?" he thundered. "By hell, no. I'll crush his ribs in like a rotten hazelnut before I cross the threshold. If I don't floor him now, I shall murder him some time. So as you value his existence, let me get at him." The needs of the narcissist are such that the narcissist will demand that those needs be fulfilled automatically. Heathcliff repeatedly demonstrates the need to get what he wants. "You are not going yet. Come here now, Nelly. I must either persuade or compel you to aid me in fulfilling my determination to see Catherine, and that without delay, I swear that I meditate no harm. I don't desire to cause any disturbance or to exasperate or insult Mr. Linton. I only wish to hear from herself how she is and why she has been ill, and to ask if anything that I could do would be of use to her." Heathcliff's inability to form genuine connections with others and his lack of emotional empathy demonstrate his narcissism. His relationship with Catherine Earnshaw is fraught with possessiveness, jealousy and control, rather than any genuine love and mutual respect. His fixation on possessing Catherine as a means of validating his own self-worth prevents him from forming any healthy reciprocal relationship built on trust. His inability to connect with others on a deep emotional level underscores his narcissism and his profound self-absorption as he prioritizes his own needs and desires above the emotional well-being of those around him. He boasts of his own achievements, even though this achievement can be said to be a cruel and cunning treat. He does this so that others acknowledge his greatness. For example, "I believed at one time no lessons could teach her that, and yet it is poorly learnt. For this morning she announced as a piece of appalling intelligence that I had actually succeeded in making her hate me. Negative fuel. A positive labour of Hercules, I assure you. If it be achieved, I have cause to return thanks." Heathcliff is undoubtedly a complex character, but he is a narcissist, one that is driven through his sense of entitlement, a lack of accountability for his actions, a complete absence of emotional empathy. An individual that repeatedly demonstrates grandiosity, magical thinking, and haughtiness. He engages in a variety of manipulative behaviours without due concern as to how people are affected by them, save that it achieves his aims. He shows various aspects of the narcissistic dynamic in the way that he conducts himself, and ultimately is a fascinating character that well deserves the label of narcissist. I'm H.G. Tudor. Thank you for listening to this analysis. Please do ensure that you like, comment and share it, and ensure that others are able to access it and learn more.